Friends, I want to share with you an incredibly interesting interview with Oscar Lafontaine, the former head of the SPD party, who literally stunned the journalist with his views on the current situation in Germany. And his words about Putin literally paralyzed everyone in the studio. According to him, German politicians today sorely lack the determination and firmness to say a firm no to the Americans and return the country to cooperation with Russia, without which, he believes, the German economy will inevitably decline. The politician also stressed that Germany is in a humiliated position, and no changes for the better can be expected in the near future. He believes that the Germans can only hope for the emergence of a leader who will be guided by the interests of his state, and not by instructions from outside. This material promises to be extremely interesting, so let's not delay and immediately move on to the discussion. To begin with, I'll tell you a little about Oscar Lafontaine himself. He is one of the most prominent and controversial German politicians. Lafontaine became famous for his harsh criticism of market capitalism and the policies of the European Union, especially regarding economic integration and social injustice. His views and contradictions with the leading parties have made him one of the most iconic figures in German politics. In this interview, he expressed extremely interesting thoughts about the current state of Europe. But we'll come back to his words a little later, and now I want to say a few words about Germany and the situation after the elections. The country's political scene was once again in the spotlight, as the upcoming federal election sparked a fierce struggle between the parties, each of which sought to convince voters that it was capable of leading the country out of crisis. Whether it was the energy crisis, the economic downturn, or the influence of well-known external factors, politicians actively tried to win the support of citizens. Interestingly, during the election campaign, many politicians behave as if their previous statements had never been made. And if they did, they were uttered by someone else. However, let's start with the most instructive example, the German dependence on atomic energy, which the government so stubbornly denied. According to the data, Germany imports 40 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity, half of which is nuclear energy from France, Switzerland, and Belgium. The situation looks rather ironic, considering that most recently the German leadership was proud to close the last 3 nuclear power plants, which in 2022 provided about 32 billion kilowatt-hours. Germany has abandoned its own nuclear energy, but now it is forced to consume it in imported form, packaged in elegant French and Belgian contracts. But then it's even more interesting. The head of the energy giant RWE admitted in November 2024 that Germany managed to avoid an energy collapse by literally a miracle. All resources have been devoted to maintaining the stability of the networks, but if the cold weather worsens in January, the situation may become critical. One possible solution to the problem is to turn to France for electricity again, but if the French decide that they themselves need more resources, then the Germans will only have to cook candles. Of course, dining in dim light sounds romantic, but not on the scale of an entire country. Now it's worth touching on another important topic. Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently stated in his podcast that his government is doing everything possible to ensure that the famous country is not left alone. Of course, such concern for distant neighbors looks noble, but the more money goes there, the less is left for Germany itself. Although the Chancellor assures that his goal is to prevent an escalation of the conflict involving NATO, it seems that the country's economy is already engaged in another battle, only this time with growing budget deficits. The government's logic is simple. It is better to reduce the opportunities of its own citizens than to abandon certain ideals. The internal political struggle is also gaining momentum. One of the most striking episodes was the conflict between Finance Minister Christian Lindner and CDU Chancellor candidate Friedrich Merz. Lindner sharply criticized Merz's economic views, saying that he seems to want to keep things as they are and continue the current course. Interestingly, this very course has already led Germany to the current crisis, but some politicians continue to stubbornly follow it. All this demonstrates that Germany finds itself in an extremely difficult situation where foreign policy and the domestic economy come into direct conflict. Politicians have to find a balance between high-profile ideals and the real needs of citizens. However, until this balance is found, the country continues to remain in a state of uncertainty. The only question is how long the Germans will put up with the current state of affairs before they start demanding real change. It is especially interesting to observe how Robert Habeck, once a star of German politics, is now being considered as a possible minister of economy. Is this the political version of Santa Barbara in German? You created a problem, you aggravated the crisis, now fix it. However, it would be naive to believe that correction is part of his plans. And here's the news for fans of geopolitical intrigue. While Mercedes and Volkswagen have left the Russian market, BMW continues to hold on to the last one. The company has officially stopped assembling cars in Russia and stopped supplying new models. But as it turns out, its BMW banking division continues to issue loans for the purchase of used cars. Who said that business and morality are incompatible? After all, the main thing is the numbers. BMW Bank's net profit increased by 41%. Success is success, even if it is associated with the so-called Putin's Reich. According to rumors, BMW hopes for a quick return to the Russian market after the end of the conflict. And who can blame them for that? Business is business. In this regard, it is interesting to hear what the German politician Oskar Lafontaine has to say. Here are his words. When a country harms itself, it's pretty stupid. For example, American sanctions. If they are dismantled, they benefit the United States but harm Europe, especially Germany. Added to this is the destruction of the Nord Stream gas pipeline by the United States. This is still being denied, although Biden has openly stated, "We will put an end to this." We live in strange times. Germany's economic losses already exceed €1 trillion, and anyone who justifies this, in my opinion, is just stupid. If I were the chancellor now, instead of Olaf Scholz, I would do two things. First of all, I would go to the evil Putin and say, "Could you supply us with gas and oil again?" He's already done it once. He even called me recently. I would ask for supplies directly again. And I would say to my government, it is impossible for us to buy the same Russian gas in a roundabout way. We're still addicted. We simply overpay by buying it through India and Belgium in the form of liquefied natural gas. This is idiotic. Secondly, it would be necessary to engage in honest economic stimulation, as in the United States, in order to restore infrastructure. Its destruction is unacceptable. And if someone asks how to finance it, the answer is obvious. The support of a well-known country must be stopped. It has already cost us billions, and the cost of refugees has not yet been fully calculated. We also need to respond to Trump when he comes back and says, "You have to pay more." We have to say, "No, you pay now. You have bombed the entire Middle East, and we have been housing these refugees for many years. You have destroyed our gas pipelines, and you are paying for it. We are suffering economic losses due to the sanctions. Pay for it." We finally need politicians of the level of Charles de Gaulle or Willy Brandt, who defended the interests of their countries. Today, most European politicians are too weak or too insignificant to defend Europe's interests. To this, the journalist asked, "Do you really believe they would have the guts to tell Trump, 'You're paying now'?" Lafontaine replied, "Of course, Trump would make a scandal, but he needs to say it. Otherwise, we will be in a weak position again. However, I am not in favor of confrontation. I would be looking for allies. Germany and France could fight back together. However, France is now in an even worse position than Germany when it comes to public finances and the economy. But even if Macron and I had gone to Trump today and said, 'Now you're paying, otherwise we'll show you where the crayfish hibernate,' it probably wouldn't have made a strong impression. However, this does not change the very concept that I have been advocating for decades. That's why I remember those politicians who were able to do it. We need leaders who are capable of defending the interests of their countries, rather than acting to please others." The journalist asked another important question. "But is the position of chancellor attractive at all now?" Lafontaine replied, "Politics is always about values. What values does a person consider to be the main ones? How does he define them? What methods does he use to protect them? Today, it seems that we live in a society where everything goes too hard. We constantly discuss moral principles. Even the foreign policy of the current German foreign minister is based solely on moral principles. This is obvious in many aspects. Here's another example for you. In recent years, when Sarah Wagenknecht used the word truce in TV debates, she was immediately accused of promoting Kremlin propaganda and called a puppet. However, the situation has changed, although not because of our efforts, but because the conflict itself continues to develop. Today, it seems that Russia is gaining the upper hand, and those who do not see this simply turn a blind eye to reality. Now, the US president himself, whom many consider to be the main initiator of the current crisis, is voicing the same theses that we have been saying for more than a year and a half: the need for a truce and peace negotiations. Since most people tend to follow the position of the authorities, those who condemned us for such statements a year ago now support calls for a ceasefire and a search for a diplomatic solution. It turns out that the very leader who is accused of creating problems may be the one who will help to get out of them. I have repeatedly stressed that the final development of this conflict is determined not only by Ukraine, but primarily by the actions of the United States and Russia. Therefore, any decisions that the American president makes are crucial. And if his statements about the truce are really serious, this could be a historic moment. Friends, now let's turn to Germany, the largest economy in Europe, a powerful industrial power with a rich past. However, with all these advantages, the country remains incapable of real independence. How can we talk about sovereignty if another country's military bases are located on its territory? American bases have long been a familiar part of the German landscape, like a guarantee that Germany will not make decisions on its own. Imagine a man who claims to be independent, but at the same time has friends living in his house all the time with their own keys to the refrigerator and bedroom. This is exactly the situation Germany finds itself in, but it seems that it has come to terms with it for a long time. However, the US military presence is just the tip of the iceberg. The main problems lie in the German elites, who are guided by the interests of the transatlantic alliance. After the explosion of the Nord Stream gas pipelines, Germany lost cheap energy resources, which put its industry on the brink of survival. But surprisingly, the German authorities did not even try to figure out the reasons for what happened. This is a vivid example of modern politics. The problem is obvious, but instead of solving it, it's more convenient to just pretend that nothing happened. Even when a well-known journalist conducted an investigation and hinted at possible US involvement, the German leadership chose to turn away, assuring citizens that everything is under control. But is this really the case? In 2023 alone, more than 27,000 enterprises went bankrupt in Germany, which is 20% more than in the previous year. Maybe this is the new economic course: to get rid of industry as quickly as possible? Germany, once the leading industrial country in Europe, is now losing its production, which is moving to other regions where the political situation is more stable. But if economic problems can be explained in some way, then the deployment of American intermediate-range missiles in Germany, scheduled for 2026, is a completely different matter. I would like to remind you that there is a 2+4 agreement signed by Germany, according to which the deployment of foreign troops on the territory of the former GDR is prohibited. However, in practice, NATO has long been established in East Germany, and no one pays attention to the legal restrictions. How do ordinary Germans react to this? Or were they just taught not to ask uncomfortable questions? It would be logical to question such a strategy, especially in the context of the energy crisis. The severance of ties with Russia and the abandonment of its gas made Germany completely dependent on the supply of American liquefied natural gas. However, this gas is 30 to 40% more expensive, but the authorities continue to convince citizens that everything is going according to plan. It seems that Berlin has decided to return to its roots and become an agrarian power. After all, industry is an outdated concept, right? Western experts have long pointed to this trend. Thus, the political scientist Schreier once noted that Germany has lost the ability to make strategic decisions in its own interests. In his opinion, Berlin is now only following Washington's directives, and national policy has become secondary. And this is a really alarming signal. Germany, once a symbol of industrial might and economic stability, is turning into a country that has lost the concept of its national interests. Of course, Berlin could declare its position, but prefers to remain silent. Perhaps this is a new style of German diplomacy, keeping a low profile. Or is it just a convenient way to get away from responsibility? What the future of Germany will be like remains an open question. However, one thing is for sure: A country that does not protect its interests cannot expect respect. Germany deserves more, but for that it needs to at least remember what it means to be independent. In the meantime, all that remains is silence and new concessions to their partners. In conclusion, I would like to say a few words about a man who has always commanded my respect. Oscar Lafontaine is one of the few politicians who is not afraid to tell the truth, even if it is unpopular. He is not afraid to challenge established norms and always argues his position logically and carefully. It is especially important that Lafontaine always stands for social justice and the protection of the interests of ordinary citizens, not large corporations. In a world where many politicians prefer to remain silent or compromise, his honesty and integrity really stand out. Thanks for your attention. I wish you good health. See you soon.